The American Yawp, Chapter 10, American Democracy, Section 1, Introduction. On January 20th, 1835, an unemployed English immigrant named Richard Lawrence aimed two pistols at President Andrew Jackson. From a mere 8 feet away, he pulled both triggers in the first ever assassination attempt on an American president. Remarkably, both weapons misfired, and Jackson took off after the would-be killer with his cane upraised. Although the assailant was motivated by a misguided belief that Jackson had killed his father, Jackson insisted the incident must have been politically motivated. Jackson interpreted the assassination attempt within the political climate of the time, one in which violence was a regular occurrence, immigrants drew increased scrutiny, conspiracy theories ran rife, and partisan strains threatened the sinews of American life. Few political figures in American history have been mired in as much controversy as Andrew Jackson, so it is perhaps unsurprising that he was the first to face an attempt on his life. To some, Jackson represented the nation's first and greatest champion of democracy for the common man. To others, Jackson was a tyrannical and aggressive threat to American republicanism. Undoubtedly, Jackson was a pivotal figure in a transitional moment in the 19th century. During the 1830s, the United States grappled with foundational questions relating to the nature of the nation's government, economy, political life, demographic composition, and moral character. In some way, each of these issues became a flashpoint for debate during Jackson's administration. Section 2, Jackson's Chaotic Cabinet. As Jackson entered the White House, his desire to institute reform would be hampered by a series of political crises engulfing his cabinet. These controversies would test not only the bounds of Jackson's political power, but the configuration of American constitutional democracy itself. His supporters, a loose coalition of small farmers and mechanics, skilled urban laborers in the North and West, along with Southern planters, lacked a clear vision of what that reform might look like, a problem that would plague his administration in coming years. He assembled a geographically and ideologically diverse cabinet to advise him on national affairs and balance the tensions brewing between Vice President John C. Calhoun and Jackson's close advisor, Martin Van Buren. Yet even within the ranks of his allies, issues ranging from tax policy to the politics of high society would threaten Jackson's ability to govern effectively. While Jackson's cabinet began the work of rooting out corruption, for indeed they did uncover evidence of officials having embezzled $457,000 from the government, a more personal crisis would begin to drive a wedge between Jackson, his vice president, and the entire cabinet. The Eaton affair, sometimes insultingly called the Petticoat affair, began as a disagreement among elite women in Washington, D.C., that would eventually lead to the disbanding of Jackson's cabinet. Jackson promptly instructed his cabinet to begin instituting the first of his major reforms in 1829, removing corrupt officials from federal positions and instituting a policy of rotation in office. Breaking with the precedent of former presidents who rarely dismissed people from appointments unless they were visibly unscrupulous or incompetent, his administration removed 900 federal officials from positions on the basis that long-term office holding represented a kind of undemocratic privilege. While many of his supporters lauded this move as egalitarian, others could not make sense of the decision to remove qualified public servants and replace them with those they saw as inexperienced lackeys. These critics followed New York Senator William L. Macy in derisively describing this as the spoils system. Jackson set a new precedent. Presidents for the next 50 years would distribute patronage posts as a reward to their political supporters, regardless of their level of qualification. Jackson preferred Washington outsiders. One such man was his friend John Henry Eaton, a senator from Tennessee, whom Jackson nominated to serve as Secretary of War. Only a few months earlier, Eaton had married Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, the recent widow of a Navy officer. She was the daughter of Washington boarding house proprietors, and her humble origins and her combination of beauty, outspokenness, and familiarity with so many men in the boarding house led to gossip. When her first husband died, rumors swirled that she and Eaton had been having an affair. Their quick marriage, a mere 9 months following her first husband's death, scandalized the women of high Washington society. One wrote that Margaret Eaton's reputation had been totally destroyed. The wives of cabinet members, led by the vice president's wife, Floride Calhoun, refused to have anything to do with her. This social snubbing had great political importance. Although women could not vote or hold office, they played an important role in politics. They held considerable influence and, as one local society woman noted, had as much rivalship and party spirit as their male counterparts. Their presence in D.C. blurred the lines between the social and political realms, with purportedly social events becoming the sites of ongoing political deal-making. The social exclusion of Margaret Eaton snowballed into a major political crisis when the president, already sensitive to these types of dynamics due to a similar scandal involving his recently deceased wife Rachel, took her under his wing. When Jackson realized the gossip originated from the wives of his own cabinet members, it opened a deep rift between himself and especially his vice president that would eventually lead to the dissolution of his cabinet. The hostility among Jackson's cabinet would only deepen amid a sectional dispute over national tax policy. When Jackson was inaugurated, most Southerners, Calhoun included, expected him to do away with the so-called Tariff of Abominations. The Tariff of 1828, an import tax providing protection for Northern manufacturing interests from European competitors, drove up costs for Southerners who were forced to purchase more expensive Northern goods and hit with retaliation from countries like Great Britain who purchased less Southern cotton in response. South Carolina, Calhoun's home state, led the charge against the tariff, which they also saw as an entering wedge for federal legislation limiting slavery. The real fear was that the federal government might attack the peculiar domestic institution of the Southern states, meaning slavery. When Jackson failed to act against the tariff, Vice President Calhoun was caught in a tight position. In 1828, Calhoun secretly drafted the South Carolina Exposition in protest, an essay and set of resolutions that laid out the doctrine of nullification or declaring a law null and void. Drawing from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and 1799, he argued that the states retained sovereignty within the national compact and could thus nullify unconstitutional federal statutes, or if necessary, leave the Union. When Calhoun's authorship became public, Jackson interpreted it as a personal betrayal as well as a challenge to his authority, and increasingly began to rely more heavily on the more informal group of advisors dubbed his kitchen cabinet. Regardless of the distractions caused by the Eaton affair and Calhoun's disloyalty, Jackson worked to promote his agenda and use his authority as executive to dismantle federal overreach. That he could do so while also launching political assaults on his enemies, Henry Clay and now John C. Calhoun, was an added bonus. Under the justification that it was a local rather than national matter, Jackson vetoed an 1830 bill championed by Clay and Calhoun that would have funded internal improvements in Kentucky. The Maysville Road veto would not be the only time he mobilized this distinct presidential power. During his 2 terms, he would invoke the veto power more than any of his predecessors. The ongoing tensions in his cabinet would continue to vex Jackson until March 1831, when Van Buren offered his resignation, opening the door for Jackson to reorganize his entire cabinet. By mid-April, Jackson called for and received the resignations of the anti-Eaton cabinet members. In the end, only a single member of his original cabinet remained, the rest replaced with new appointees whose primary loyalty was to the president himself. Section 3, Nullification and the Bank War. Another long-simmering issue central to Jackson's platform and popularity was his distrust of the Bank of the United States. First established under Alexander Hamilton's financial plan and then rechartered by Congress in 1816, the bank was designed to stabilize the growing American economy by establishing a national currency and regulating state banks and public credit. A private corporation, the Second Bank of the United States, was tasked with federal responsibilities, including holding and dispersing federal funds. Though many Democratic Republicans had supported the bank, some remained suspicious about the dependability and constitutionality of the institution and grew distrustful of paper currency. The bank came under additional scrutiny after the Panic of 1819 as Jackson and others blamed the bank for the economic downturn, and as federal land sales brought in enormous amounts of money by the early 1830s, critics worried that the bank and its representatives were restricting state banks and businesses for their own profit. Early in his first term, Jackson set his sights on the bank and its director, Nicholas Biddle, who represented the elite moneyed interests he hoped to dislodge. An early effort to recharter the monster bank fell in the midst of an election year, and its passage through both houses of Congress left Jackson in a difficult position. As Biddle clearly knew, if Jackson failed to sign the rechartering bill into law, it could impact his re-election. For Jackson, Biddle's tactics smacked of blackmail. Unswayed, he told Van Buren, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." He vetoed the bill to recharter the bank. In his veto message, Jackson articulated the values that defined his presidency. He called the bank unconstitutional and dangerous to the liberties of the people. The bank was virtually a federal agency, but it had powers that were not granted anywhere in the Constitution. Worst of all, the bank was a way for well-connected people to get richer at everyone else's expense. Only a strictly limited government, Jackson believed, would treat people equally. Although its charter would not be renewed, the Bank of the United States could still operate for several more years. So, in 1833, to diminish its power, Jackson also directed his cabinet to stop depositing federal funds in it. From now on, the government would do business with selected state banks instead. Critics called them Jackson's pet banks, and although the bank veto set off fierce controversy, the bank war gave his supporters a specific democratic idea to rally around. More than any other issue, opposition to the national bank came to define their beliefs. Meanwhile, Jackson continued to try to calm the situation that had emerged with his Southern supporters over tariff disputes. Congress had acceded to Jackson's calls for reductions in tariffs in 1832, lowering rates on some products but keeping them high on others, but this was not enough to diffuse the tensions. Jackson had replaced Calhoun as his running mate, and Calhoun returned to South Carolina, where a special state convention nullified the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832. It declared them unconstitutional and therefore null, void, and no law within South Carolina. The convention ordered South Carolina customs officers not to collect tariff revenue and declared that any federal attempt to enforce the tariffs would lead to secession. President Jackson responded dramatically. He denounced the ordinance of nullification and declared that disunion by armed force is treason. Vowing to hang Calhoun and any other nullifier who defied federal power, he persuaded Congress to pass a force bill that authorized him to send the military to enforce the tariffs. Faced with such threats, other Southern states declined to join South Carolina. Privately, however, Jackson supported the idea of compromise and allowed his political enemy, Henry Clay, to broker a solution with Calhoun. Congress passed a compromise bill that slowly lowered federal tariff rates. South Carolina rescinded nullification for the tariffs, but also nullified the force bill. Jackson's decisive action seemingly forced South Carolina to back down, but the crisis also united the ideas of secession and states' rights, two concepts that had not necessarily been linked before. Perhaps most clearly, nullification showed the immense political power of enslavers. During later debates in the 1840s and 1850s, they would raise the idea of nullification again.